You know that feeling when you're at the grocery store, standing in the checkout line, and you're mentally calculating whether you can actually afford the organic chicken breast you just put in your cart? And then you glance at the person ahead of you, casually buying whatever they want without even looking at the total, and you start wondering if everyone else has some secret financial manual you never received. Maybe you're refreshing your bank app before accepting a dinner invitation, trying to figure out if you can afford to split appetizers and still make rent. Or you're explaining to your parents why you're not buying a house yet, and they look at you like you're speaking a foreign language because when they were 30, mortgages were something responsible adults just did, like getting married or having kids. Here's what nobody tells you. You're probably doing exactly average for your age, and average has shifted so dramatically in the past 30 years that what feels like failure might actually be normal. And what previous generations considered normal financial progress might be completely unrealistic for anyone turning 30 today. My name is Anderson, and I've spent years analyzing why 30-year-olds today inhabit a completely different economic reality than their parents did at the same age. Not because they're less disciplined or less motivated, but because the fundamental economics of being 30 have been rewritten in ways most people don't fully understand. If you want to know where you actually stand compared to everyone else your age, and more importantly, why those comparisons matter less than you think, stay with me through this. Make sure to subscribe if this perspective helps clarify things you've been feeling but couldn't articulate. Now, when someone says the average 30-year-old, what image forms in your mind? Do you picture someone who's achieved some version of traditional adult stability? Someone with a career path, maybe a starter home, a growing retirement account, and a general sense that they're on track towards something that resembles financial security? Or do you imagine someone who looks successful from the outside, but is privately running calculations before every purchase, carrying debt balances that grow despite regular payments, and wondering when this whole adulting thing is supposed to start feeling less like barely managing and more like actually thriving? The disconnect between those two images is where today's 30-year-olds actually live. In that gap between what we think financial normalcy should look like and what the numbers actually show, and understanding that gap isn't just about feeling better or worse about your own situation. It's about recognizing that we're witnessing a fundamental restructuring of how entire generations build wealth or fail to. Think about what your parents accomplished by 30. There's a reasonable chance they owned property, had minimal educational debt, and could support a household on one income if they chose to. Not because they were exceptional savers or financial geniuses, but because the basic economics of housing, education, and income made those milestones accessible to average earners. If you're 30 today, you're navigating something completely different. You're managing educational debt loads your parents' generation never imagined, housing costs that consume income percentages they would have considered impossible, and economic structures that have fundamentally altered what financial success even means at your age. So let's examine what 30 actually looks like financially in contemporary America, starting with the debt category that's reshaping every other financial decision for this age group: student loans. And I need you to brace yourself because these figures are going to either validate everything you've been feeling or make you grateful you're not carrying the median burden. The typical 30-year-old in America is carrying $42,000 in educational debt. $42,000. That's not what they borrowed initially. That's what remains after they've been making payments for years. In many cases, that balance represents more than they originally borrowed because interest capitalization has quietly grown the principal while they've been paying. That $42,000 translates to monthly payments around $436 every month. Money that can't build emergency savings, can't fund retirement accounts, can't accumulate toward property down payments. It simply disappears into loan servicing for the next decade, assuming someone stays on the standard 10-year track. But here's the part that reveals how insidious this system has become. A substantial portion of 30-year-olds aren't even managing that standard payment. Because $436 monthly is unsustainable against their other expenses, They've shifted to income-driven plans that reduce immediate payments but extend repayment timelines and often allow balances to actually grow through interest that outpaces their reduced payments. Let me introduce you to Jessica. She's 32, works in healthcare administration, earning $70,000 annually, which positions her above the median for her cohort. Jessica graduated with $58,000 in loans from her master's program in public health. When payments started, the standard track wanted $740 monthly. That felt crushing against her other obligations, so she enrolled in an income-driven plan that brought her payment down to $390. For 4 years, Jessica made every payment religiously. She never missed a due date, never requested forbearance, did everything the system told her represented responsible borrowing behavior. In those 4 years, her loan balance grew from $58,000 to $62,800. She had paid nearly $19,000 in total payments, and her debt had grown by $4,800. Think about the psychological damage that creates. You're being responsible, you're making payments, you're doing everything society tells you represents adult financial behavior, and you're watching your debt expand anyway. You're literally paying money to become more indebted. When Jessica finally understood what was happening and switched to the standard plan, her payment jumped to $810 because now she was paying against the inflated principal. That's roughly 16% of her gross income, closer to 22% of her take-home after taxes and the retirement contribution her employer matches. Jessica's situation illustrates something crucial about educational debt for 30-year-olds. It's not merely about the payment amount. It's about how the architecture of repayment options can trap responsible borrowers in cycles that make debt grow, and how this fundamentally delays every other adult milestone. Marriage calculations now include combining 2 sets of loan payments. Home buying requires explaining to mortgage underwriters why your debt-to-income ratio looks concerning despite stable employment. Family planning means calculating whether adding dependents is financially feasible while carrying debt that won't disappear for another 15 years. The secondary effects compound beyond just monthly obligations. Recent analysis shows that student loan delinquencies have triggered credit score drops exceeding 100 points for over 1 million borrowers. People who maintained scores of 720 or higher saw average declines of 177 points after falling behind. This means 30-year-olds who might have qualified for favorable mortgage terms, reasonable auto loan rates, or premium credit cards suddenly face higher borrowing costs or outright rejections. It creates this cascading effect where student loan struggles amplify into broader financial constraints, affecting everything from vehicle purchases to housing access. And unlike virtually any other debt category, educational loans survive bankruptcy, meaning this burden persists regardless of what else happens financially. But educational debt represents only one dimension of the debt landscape for 30-year-olds. Credit card balances tell an equally revealing story about how economic pressure and lifestyle requirements converge during this life phase. The average 30-year-old carries over $4,000 in revolving credit card debt. $4,000 might sound manageable compared to those 5-figure student loan numbers, but credit card debt operates under completely different rules. We're discussing interest rates averaging 22% annually, which means that $4,000 balance costs nearly $900 yearly just in interest charges if you're only making minimum payments. But here's what's actually happening with credit card debt among 30-year-olds, and this is where the narrative becomes more complex and, honestly, more understandable. This isn't predominantly debt from reckless spending or luxury indulgences. This is debt from the reality of maintaining adult life in contemporary America. 30-year-olds today increasingly use credit cards to cover basic necessities that previous generations managed with regular income alone. We're talking about groceries when the paycheck doesn't extend as far as the month does, car repairs that can't wait for the next pay cycle, medical expenses that insurance mysteriously decides not to cover. And yes, occasionally some retail purchase after staring at loan balances that seem designed to destroy hope. Research confirms that younger consumers, particularly millennials and Gen Z adults, increasingly rely on credit cards and installment payment services for everyday essentials. This isn't about purchasing designer goods or booking luxury travel. This is about the gap between what 30-year-olds earn and what it actually costs to maintain basic adult existence in modern America. Consider Marcus, who represents the median 30-year-old experience almost perfectly. Marcus is 30, works in digital marketing, earning $56,000 annually, which places him right at the national median for his demographic. He graduated in 2017 with $38,000 in educational loans and has been making payments for 7 years. His monthly student loan payment is $395. Marcus also carries $4,200 in credit card debt. Before you conclude Marcus lacks financial discipline, let me explain how he accumulated this balance. $1,700 came from his apartment's water heater, flooding his unit and destroying his furniture, which his renter's insurance covered after he paid the deductible and waited 6 weeks for reimbursement. $1,000 came from dental work when he discovered his employer's dental plan considers anything beyond basic cleaning essentially cosmetic. The remaining $1,500 represents what financial advisors call lifestyle creep, but what Marcus calls attempting to maintain sanity while functioning as an adult. This includes occasionally purchasing fresh produce instead of exclusively canned goods, replacing his phone when the screen shattered after 2 years of service, and sometimes ordering delivery after working 11-hour days because the alternative was sitting in his kitchen, staring at empty cabinets and contemplating his life choices. Marcus's minimum credit card payment runs about $135 monthly. Here's where the mathematics of being 30 becomes genuinely depressing. At 22% interest, if Marcus only makes minimum payments, he'll be paying off this debt for over 16 years and will ultimately pay more than $9,000 total for that water heater damage and that dental work. The actual problem isn't that Marcus is financially irresponsible. The actual problem is he's spending 42% of his take-home pay on rent for a one-bedroom apartment, another 14% on his car payment and insurance, and roughly 12% on combined student loan and credit card minimums. This leaves him with extremely limited capacity for building reserves, which means the next unexpected expense will almost certainly become additional credit card debt. Marcus's situation perfectly demonstrates why credit card debt has become such a persistent issue for 30-year-olds. It's not about lack of discipline. It's about the mathematical reality that even responsible spending patterns and stable employment barely match the pace of basic adult obligations. But here's where things become even more striking. Let's discuss housing, because this is where 30-year-olds today face perhaps the most dramatic departure from their parents' financial experience. The homeownership rate for adults under 35 has declined to 37%, the lowest level in 4 years. This means nearly 2/3 of 30-year-olds are still renting, not by preference, but because homeownership has become mathematically unattainable for most people their age. The median home price in America now exceeds $500,000. $500,000. This means a typical 30-year-old would need $100,000 for a 20% down payment to avoid private mortgage insurance. $100,000. Most 30-year-olds don't have $100,000 in savings, period, let alone available for property purchase. But the situation deteriorates further. Even if you somehow assembled that down payment, the average mortgage rate in 2024 was 6.7%. That translates to monthly payments on a $500,000 house with 20% down of approximately $2,400, excluding property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. $2,400 monthly. Remember Marcus, our median 30-year-old earning $56,000 annually? His take-home pay after taxes probably runs around $3,700 monthly. A $2,400 mortgage payment would consume 65% of his entire take-home income. Financial guidance recommends spending no more than 28% of gross income on housing, which for Marcus would be approximately $1,300 monthly. This is why so many 30-year-olds live in apartments costing $1,800 to $2,100 monthly in rent. They're spending 45 to 55% of income on housing, not because they're making poor decisions, but because those are literally the only options available in most employment markets. The psychological impact of this housing situation cannot be overstated. Previous generations viewed their 20s as establishment years and their 30s as the phase for purchasing property, starting families, and building equity through homeownership. Today's 30-year-olds watch rent payments vanish into landlords' accounts month after month, building zero equity while home prices continue rising faster than their capacity to save for down payments. Many 30-year-olds occupy this strange financial position where they earn too much to qualify for first-time buyer assistance programs, but too little to actually afford properties in areas where they work. They're trapped, paying rent that often exceeds what mortgage payments would be, but unable to access home ownership because of down payment requirements and debt-to-income calculations. This housing crisis is fundamentally altering life timelines for 30-year-olds. People are delaying marriage because combining two sets of student loan obligations doesn't improve anyone's debt-to-income ratio for mortgage qualification. They're postponing children because raising kids in small rental units while managing student loans and credit card debt feels financially irresponsible. They're watching peers in lower-cost regions buy houses and start families while feeling trapped in expensive cities where their careers exist but homeownership remains fantasy. The rental market itself has become increasingly challenging for 30-year-olds. Landlords routinely require credit scores above 700, income verification at least 3 times monthly rent, and application fees running several $100s per property. For 30-year-olds dealing with student loan impacts on credit scores, securing acceptable rental housing has become a challenge previous generations never encountered. But perhaps the most shocking statistic about 30-year-old finances isn't about debt at all, it's about savings. And these numbers are going to make you question everything you thought you understood about financial responsibility. According to financial planning guidance, 30-year-olds should have saved the equivalent of their annual salary by age 30. So if you're earning $60,000 yearly, you should theoretically have $60,000 sitting in savings accounts and investment portfolios. Ready for reality? Only 14% of Americans have at least $100,000 in savings. More than half of all Americans cannot cover an unexpected $1,000 expense without borrowing. Let me emphasize that because it's important. More than half of Americans your age cannot handle a $1,000 emergency without incurring debt. We're not discussing a major medical crisis or job loss. We're talking about your car needing new brakes or your refrigerator deciding to stop refrigerating at the worst possible moment. The median savings balance for all Americans is $62,400, but remember that includes people of all ages, including those approaching retirement who've had decades to accumulate wealth. When you examine it by age cohort, the numbers become even more concerning. The reality is most 30-year-olds have savings balances that financial advisors would characterize as dangerously insufficient. But here's what makes this story genuinely interesting, and this is something nobody discusses in those cheerful financial planning articles. The guidance to have a year's salary saved by 30 assumes that 30-year-olds have been able to save consistently throughout their 20s. It assumes they weren't managing entry-level salaries, student loan payments, high rent costs, and all the expenses accompanying the establishment of adult life. Think about the mathematics here. If you graduated college at 22 with student loans, spent your early 20s earning $35,000 to $45,000 annually while paying $600 monthly in student loans and $1,400 monthly in rent, when exactly were you supposed to accumulate this magical year salary in savings? It's like instructing someone to run a marathon while carrying a 70-pound backpack and then expressing surprise when they're not setting speed records. The gap between financial guidance and financial reality for 30-year-olds has become so vast, it's almost absurd. Financial planning resources cheerfully suggest that 30-year-olds should be saving $800 monthly toward retirement alone, not counting emergency funds or other savings objectives. $800 monthly for someone earning the median income of $56,000, that represents about 28% of their take-home pay after taxes. Meanwhile, in the actual world, that same person is spending 42% of income on rent, 12% on student loans, and attempting to maintain a social existence that doesn't involve exclusively eating ramen in their studio apartment. The concept of having $800 remaining each month for savings exists in the same fictional realm as affordable healthcare and reasonable education costs. This creates what I call the financial guidance paradox for 30-year-olds. Every article, podcast, and financial expert tells them they should be saving more, investing aggressively, and building wealth for the future. But the actual financial constraints they face make following this guidance practically impossible without making sacrifices that would negatively impact their career development, relationships, or mental health. Consider retirement savings specifically, because this is where the disconnect between expectations and reality becomes most apparent. According to Fidelity, 30-year-olds should have a full year's salary in retirement accounts. If you're earning $60,000, you should have $60,000 in your 401k. The reality? Most 30-year-olds have retirement balances that wouldn't fund a decent vacation, let alone decades of not working. The average retirement account balance for people in their 30s hovers around $15,000. $15,000 to fund potentially 40 years of retirement. Using the traditional 4% withdrawal rule, that $15,000 would generate about $600 annually in retirement income. That's $50 monthly. $50 monthly wouldn't cover streaming services, let alone housing, food, healthcare, and all the other expenses that come with being alive. So there you have it, the unfiltered financial reality of being 30 in America today. If these numbers made you feel worse about your situation, understand you're not navigating this economic landscape alone. If they made you feel better, congratulations on exceeding some genuinely difficult odds. Either way, understanding where you actually stand compared to your peers represents the first step toward making more informed financial decisions. Because honestly, pretending everything is fine while managing overwhelming debt isn't a strategy. It's just expensive avoidance. The system has changed, the rules have changed, and recognizing that reality is how you start designing something different for yourself.